Tonight I'd like to start speaking about the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which was the second discourse that the Buddha taught after his awakening, and look at the not-self characteristic, Anatta Lakkhana. The Buddha attained awakening on the full moon of Visakha, roughly May. He taught the first discourse, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma 2 months later, at the full moon of Asalha in July. And in this discourse he taught the middle way and the Four Truths. So we've had a couple of talks looking at, first of all, the middle way as the Buddha's fundamental framework. The middle way is both a doctrine and it's also a strategy. Remember the context, he was speaking to his 5 former companions and he wanted to somehow communicate the correct path to them. They were committed practitioners, very dedicated, even fanatical, but the Buddha knew that they were on the wrong path because that was the path that he was on, and he saw that it was a dead end, and he wanted to pull them from that one to a path that would lead to awakening. And he used the middle way as his strategy to prise open their delusion, their fixed view. And we looked at the middle way is the way which cannot be defined as the opposite of something else. We live in a world of opposites. This is opposite to that. This is good, that's bad. This is me, that's you. And we find our identity and our security in the mind landing on one of these opposites and defining itself. This is who I am. I know who I am because I am not that. So this is the way that we normally create a sense of who we are. The middle way is the position of no fixed position. The middle way is a dynamic balance between the opposites, or it's found in that balance. We looked at it in terms of the practice by looking at the problem of effort, which is a real problem for meditators. Finding right effort is difficult. Sometimes we might put in a lot of effort, really pushing ourselves to get to a particular meditation object and hold it. But that might end up in strain, tension. Or we might go to the opposite and just relax. But that might end up in drifting, vagueness. Right effort is found in a dynamic balance between these two opposites. And it cannot be pinned down. Sometimes it is appropriate to go in and focus. Sometimes it's appropriate to pull back and go wide. In one discourse on Satipatthana, the Buddha talks about samadhi with direction and samadhi without direction. Sometimes there's a direction. Zero in on this. Sometimes there's no direction. It's completely open. It's not that there's one right way, which is the opposite of the wrong way. It's a question of what is appropriate now in this particular set of circumstances. This is very frustrating for those of us who want a clear method, who want to be told what to do. No matter what it is, we just want to be told what to do and keep it simple. But we find that the meditation practice is alive and it cannot be pinned down to one simple set of instructions. We start with a simple set of instructions. That gets us going. But then it starts to open up. And we find we cannot pin it down to one simple method or one simple technique. And so you find, if you talk to fellow meditators about their practice, you might find different people are doing very different things. Sometimes because that's what's appropriate for this particular person at this particular time. This is the middle way. It's characterized by dynamism and by not getting stuck anywhere. And actually this middle way already includes anatta, not self. But it's not made explicit. It's not specifically mentioned. And then the Buddha taught the Four Truths. And at the end of the discourse, Anya Kondanya understood and got a glimpse of the unconstructed, of Nibbana. Whatever is of the nature to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. And so again you get this sense of dynamism, movement, change. This first discourse, as we said, is significant because the Dharma wheel turns when somebody else understands it. Now it's not just the Buddha, but the beginnings of a whole community. At the end of the first discourse, the Buddha begins the first Buddhist meditation retreat. The Buddha himself is the teacher. There are 5 students, the 5 companions. These are Kondanya, Vappa, Bhaddiya, Mahanama and Assaji. And the retreat lasts 5 days. One by one, the other 4 companions attain the first stage of awakening. Kondanya was the quickest. He got there just listening to the first discourse. The slowest and the dullest were Mahanama and Assaji. They took 5 full days to attain to the first stage of awakening. Incredible. Hopeless. I'm sure we can all do better. At the end of this period, all the 5 students have attained the first stage of awakening. So this means they've all directly encountered the unconstructed, Nibbana itself. Then the Buddha teaches another discourse. And this one is Anattalakkhana Sutta, the teaching on the not-self characteristic. Now you notice he does not mention this teaching explicitly until all of his audience have attained the first stage of awakening. All of them have a direct encounter and understanding of Nibbana, and all of them are therefore mature practitioners. What does this tell us? It tells us that the teaching of anatta is an advanced teaching. Sometimes people complain that they don't understand it. I remember one person in particular, some years ago, a man who had been practicing and studying Buddhism for decades. He was complaining to me that he had listened to countless Dharma talks on anatta, on not-self, and still no teacher had explained it satisfactorily so that he could understand it. He seemed to indicate that they weren't doing a very good job. And I was getting very worried because I was afraid he was going to ask me to explain it. But the problem is, if I had, I would have failed. Because actually, you cannot understand anatta. Anatta is not something you can understand. You can understand different doctrines intellectually, play around with the words and speak learnedly about them. But anatta is not something that can be understood. It has to be realized. We either realize it or we don't. It's like a joke. Someone tells you a joke. That there's a build-up and then they give you the punchline. And you either get it or you don't get it. If someone has to explain a joke, it's not funny. And fundamentally, it cannot be explained. You might get the logical connections and why they said the last line having said the others, but it's not, you cannot explain it. You either get it or you don't get it. It's really that simple. And anatta is the same. We either get it or we don't get it. It's not a question of understanding it. And I emphasize this point because I want to make it clear, and we may have 3 talks on this discourse over the next 3 nights, but I want to make it clear to you, if we do, at the end of these 3 talks, you will still not understand anatta. So please do not be disappointed. So this is how the discourse begins. This is how I heard it. Once the Blessed One was living at Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana. There he addressed the group of 5 bhikkhus. Bhikkhus, Bhante, they replied. The Blessed One said, body is not self. If this body was self, it would not tend to get sick, and I could make it become what I want. But because body is not self, it does tend to get sick, and I cannot make it become what I want. Feeling is not self. Perception is not self. Constructions are not self. Awareness is not self. If this awareness was self, it would not tend to get sick, and I could make it become what I want. But because awareness is not self, it does tend to get sick, and I cannot make it become what I want. This is the opening section. The first thing we notice is that when the Buddha introduces this subject of not self, it's presented as bad news, not as good news, which is, I find interesting, because usually I find when people talk about anatta and sunyata, emptiness, it's presented as good news. This is the great liberation. At last we are free of self. But when the Buddha introduces the subject, he introduces it as bad news, which is interesting. Perhaps we'll see why as we get through it. And he introduces it in relation to the 5 aggregates, the 5 khandha, the panch upadana khandha, the 5 pancha upadana khandha. Upadana is usually translated as clinging, and khandha is usually translated as aggregate. The 5 aggregates associated with clinging, or the 5 clung to aggregates. This is a very technical expression. In the original Pali, you get not just the technical expression, but you get a much more earthy, direct image. Because in Pali, khandha is aggregate in the sense of a collection of things. So this collection of people in this room is a khandha, for example. In the context of the 5 khandhas, it's 5 collections or categories of experience, of human experience. Basically, the Buddha looks at the nature of human experience and divides it into 5 categories. And these 5 categories are the 5 aggregates. Here you could translate khandha as category. So the 5 categories associated with clinging. But khandha also in Pali means mass, like a big collection of stuff. And upadana is clinging, but also in Pali it means fuel. So 5 masses or piles of fuel. Imagine you have a great big heap of wood, and another one, another one, another one, another one. 5 of them. 5 piles of wood that are ready to set fire at any time. All you've got to do is toss a match in, boom, you have a bonfire, huge fire. And this is the image that the Buddha is presenting, and this is the human condition. We are like, to use a modern analogy, we are like a bomb ready to go off. We're like a fire ready to start blazing. All someone has to do is toss a match of a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste, a touch, a thought, and whammo, up goes the fire. It might be anger, it might be desire, it might be obsession, it might be fear, it might be anxiety. But it's like we're just ready to go off as soon as someone tosses the match. This is the image that the Buddha is presenting as the human condition. Get this image of 5 bombs ready to go off, 5 fires ready to burst into flame at a moment's notice. But underneath that you get this technical idea of the nature of human experience divided into 5 categories. And the categories are body, feeling, perception, constructions, and awareness. Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, and Vijnana. Now the first 2, of course, are the same as the first 2 Satipatthanas. Body, as we've seen, all physical experience. Feeling, Vedana, the hedonic or affective aspect of all experience. In other words, that which moves us, that which provokes a response in some way. And we were talking about how if we're looking for Vedana, for feeling, we find it in our responses. If I'm responding to an experience, there's the Vedana. That's where I'll find the feeling. And I'm always responding. Then we get perception, sanya. Perception is the recognition or interpretation of any given experience. In other words, what we are convinced is going on. So right now, I am sitting here and I am convinced that I am sitting in the multi-purpose hall of SBS. I'm absolutely convinced of it. You are not going to persuade me that I'm wrong. Now, I don't think this, I just know it, because this is my perception. I recognise this particular visual and sound field as this is SBS, the multi-purpose hall. In fact, this is the multi-purpose hall at dusk. So this is perception, it's recognition. I go home, I don't have to think about what this place is. I know this is where I live. I look in the mirror in the morning and I don't have to wonder, who is that looking at me? I know. It's me. So this is perception. It's our normal, familiar, ordinary, everyday world. Then we get constructions, sankhara. Here, in this context, this means all the choices or decisions that we make, from the major ones, how I will live my life, to the minor ones, like when I just reached up and rubbed the back of my neck, to even more subtle. Why do we think? Because we choose to think. If you start to study the mind and see how thought arises, sometimes it's quite clear that a thought will arise purely at random. But when there's any kind of thinking about, why do we think about something? Because we're making a whole series of choices to think. Sometimes we don't recognise this. We think that the thinking is happening to us. We might say, I don't want to think. I'm fed up with thinking about this. I just want to drop this and concentrate on my meditation object and find peace. But actually the reason why that thought is continuing is precisely because we're choosing to keep it going. The choice, the decision is so habitual and so buried, we just don't see it. Sometimes we get a glimpse of it. So, for example, you might be meditating and then suddenly you fall into some habitual thought. It might be quite painful. And you lose your meditation, you forget the meditation object, caught up in this thought. And then suddenly you remember, oh, I'm thinking, and you realise, I really should drop this and head back to my meditation object. But then you decide, I'll just finish this off first, and then I'll go back. It won't take long, I'll just finish it off. And in that moment we can see, actually it is a choice. Because I had the opportunity to drop it. But no, I kept it going. This is constructions, and they're called constructions because they're the major way in which we construct our own lives. For the Buddha, the constructions are very important because in any given situation, say here we are right now, we're all sitting in this hall. Now let's say I come along to the retreat because I've made a choice. I've chosen to come here and participate. And then one day I'm sitting in the hall and I suddenly realise I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home. What am I doing here? Now, we have no choice about the fact that we are already here. This is where we are. In any situation, there's an aspect of the situation which is simply given. Here I am. This is it. I might suddenly decide I'm fed up with teaching this retreat. All I want is a holiday. Why am I stuck with all these people? But here I am. And I don't have any choice in the fact that here I am. What I have a choice is, okay, here I am, what do I do about it? That's a choice. So I might suddenly get up and say, look, as far as I'm concerned, the retreat's over, and walk out the door. Or I could decide, I just keep going. This is my job, so I'll just keep doing it. But these choices that I make, these will construct my life. The choices make me who I am. So I am becoming all the time. And I am moulding myself, creating myself all of the time through these choices. Over a lifetime of choices, I make myself. I still remember the day many years ago, in the mid-1970s, I had completed a BA degree at the University of Sydney. I had started on a law degree at the University of New South Wales. And one day I was sitting in the law library because I had an assignment that was due. And I had all these legal books piled around me. And I was deeply immersed reading Dr. D.T. Suzuki's Essays in Zen Buddhism, Volume 1. And I looked up from my Essays in Zen Buddhism, I looked at the legal books, and I thought, no. And I got up, collected the books, put them carefully back on the shelf, and walked out, and never came back. I made a choice. It was not a choice that my parents agreed with at the time. Well, my father was dead, so he didn't know, but my mother was rather upset. Now, if I had not made that choice, if I made another choice, looked down at the Essays in Zen Buddhism and thought, I can never make a living out of this. Put that book away, back to the law books. Certainly I would not be here. And in fact, I would be a very different person. The world would be a different place. We create ourselves and our world through the choices that we make. The Buddha is often drawing our attention to the choices that we make. They're very important. And finally, the fifth khanda, the fifth aggregate or category, is awareness, vijnana. This is the pure knowing or witnessing of any experience. And some meditators are working particularly with this, that just the knowing of the experience. This is vijnana, awareness or consciousness. These 5 categories or 5 aggregates are important because for the Buddha they constitute that which can be clung to. These are the 5 upadana khanda, the 5 aggregates, the 5 categories associated with clinging. These are the categories of experience that we cling to. In other words, these are the aspects of our experience that we find deeply, deeply attractive. So attractive, we cannot let them go. Now, attractive not in the surface sense of being pleasant or beautiful, but in the deep sense of what preoccupies us the most. Take body. I find this body deeply attractive. Not because I think it's all that wonderful. I don't think I would win a beauty contest. I don't have any illusions of that nature. But if there's a mirror in the house, every day I look into it. And I'm always interested in what I see, despite the fact that I've seen it many times before and I know exactly what I'm going to see. And yet still I'm interested. Why? But we have this deep interest, this deep fascination. It's deeply attractive. Why? Is because the body, this form, is one of the things which creates our sense of identity. I look into a mirror and what do I see? I see me. And that's what makes it interesting. I identify with the body and I construct a sense of self, a sense of identity out of that. Similarly with feeling, I construct a sense of identity out of my feelings, that which I find pleasant or painful. I don't like this. I like that. I do this because I like it. I don't do that. This is all based on Vedana, on my responses. I identify with my responses. And I also tend to associate with people who share that identification. If I like a particular kind of activity, I will tend to make friends with people who also like that activity, who share my like, or who share my dislike. We identify with our likes and our dislikes. Perception, how we recognize an experience, what we recognize things to be, this we also identify with that. I identify myself as the one at SBS. I am the one sitting here in the middle of this retreat. Constructions, the choices that we make, again we identify with these. Who is it who decides to get up from the table and take extra lunch? It's me. Who is it who decides to come and meditate? It's me. When the meditation is painful, who decides it's time to stop and gets up? I do. So I identify with my choices. And finally, awareness, vijnana. Who is it who knows all this? When the meditation is very deep, any crude sense of self has dropped away. Sometimes people say, I had an experience of anatta. I had an experience of not self. It was like this, blah, blah, blah. Who is it who knows I've just had an experience of anatta? It's the one who was aware of that. We identify with awareness. These are the 5 categories of experience that we hold on to construct a sense of identity in a world that we recognize and see as this is my world. So when the Buddha talks about not self, he talks about it in terms of these 5 categories, and he says you cannot find a self in any of these categories. Let's take the first one. Body is not self. If this body was self, it would not tend to get sick and I could make it become what I want. But because body is not self, it does tend to get sick and I cannot make it become what I want. You notice that what he's getting at is for there to be something which is, I can reasonably say, this is myself, it has to be something which is stable and which is under my control. What do we need to have a sense of identity? For me to believe I am Patrick, what do I need? Well, first of all, I need something which does not change. I can say, I'm getting older. These days when I look into the mirror, it's hard to find a hair that is not white. I'm still shocked if I'm on a bus and some adult gets up and offers me a seat. What's wrong with you? Is there somebody else? Oh, me? Well, that's right, I'm old now. I have this sense of stability. This me, sitting here, is the same me who came here 10 days ago. It's the same me who was here last year. I have been coming to SPS over, 5 years or more? The person who came here 5 years or more ago for the first time, this is the same person. So I have to have that sense of stability in order to have a sense of self. And there has to be something under the control of this stable something. I must have some things under my control. For example, I know that I'm me because I get to choose what I do. The choices we talked about. I can get up now if I want, or I can sit down now if I want. I have control. I also have possessions. And possessions are more than just things. Let's take this recorder. This recorder is different from every other recorder on the planet. Now, if you look at it or take a photograph, you'd say, no, that's an Edirol R09 portable voice recorder. There's hundreds, if not thousands of them on the planet. But as far as I'm concerned, this one is unique. And what makes it unique is that it's mine. It's my recorder. And if it's my recorder, it's under my control. That recorder goes with me back to Australia. I am in charge of that recorder. And this relationship makes this recorder unique among all the other recorders of its class. To have a self, I have to have a sense of stability and of control. The control is internal, but it's also external. There's part of the world that I am in charge of. Not very much, but there's some. And what the Buddha is doing here is he's challenging that. He's saying, look at your experience, look at your body. Is it really the same over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 60 years? Is it really the same over 60 seconds? When you really start to look at it, when you're in there and really closely examining it, are you seriously telling me that it's the same? That it doesn't change? And the meditator says, well, well, come to think of it. And then the next thing is, and are you telling me that it's under your control? So what? You're telling me that that pain you're getting in your knee, that's under your control? Is that what you're saying to me? Well, not that pain, no, but. And he goes through ruthlessly through these 5 categories. Look at it. Are you telling me that it stays the same? Are you telling me that you're the one in charge? That you actually control this? When you look closely, is that true? Can you find something that doesn't change and that you are in charge of? And of course, the deeper we go into this practice, the more we have to admit, well, no, actually, I can't find anything that fits that. This is why not self begins as bad news, because we think that we're in charge of something. We have a secure sense of identity. I'm the meditator, and I've decided to come here, and I'm going to meditate and get enlightened. And I'm in charge of this project. But when we go into it, we discover, actually, I'm not in charge of anything. And this is scary. In this retreat, some people have been quite alarmed when they look into their minds And they say something like, it's a bit of a worry because I was looking at my mind and it was just an endless flow of out-of-control defilements all of the time. That's not normal, is it? I mean, this must be an unusual experience. No, actually that's normal. That's what the mind is like. All of the time. We just don't notice it. We're so used to it. Not self appears first, actually, often as dukkha. This terrible realization that I'm not in charge. I thought I was. I took up meditation practice to be even more in charge, but it turns out that what little control I thought I had has been taken away. The Buddha continues with this line of argument. He says, what do you think, bhikkhus? Is body permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Bhante. And that which is impermanent, is it satisfying or unsatisfying? Or you could also translate this as, is it pleasant, is it painful or pleasant? Unsatisfying, Bhante. Painful, Bhante. And that which is unsatisfying and subject to change, is it appropriate to regard it in terms of, this is mine, I am this is myself? Certainly not, Bhante. So you see, the Buddha is examining his students about their experience. He's saying, look at your experience. First question, is it permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Bhante. Here the term is it nitya or anicca? In Sanskrit, nitya or anitya. Permanent here means obviously unchanging. Now, it's, I think, important to see that when the Buddha is talking about permanence, if he's saying, is this permanent? He's not asking, will this last forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, like an immortal soul, for instance. He's talking about the body. Is this body permanent or impermanent? Now, superficially, it sounds like he's asking, what do you think? Do you think one day you're going to die? Well, yes. But he's going deeper than that. For the Buddha, permanent means unchanging over time, regardless of the unit of time. In a human lifetime, does the body change? Yes. In the course of 1 year, is it permanent? Does it not change in a year? No, it changes in a year. So it's not permanent. What about over 1 day? No, it changes. So it's impermanent. What about over an hour? No, it changes. What about over a minute? No, it changes. What about a second? No, it changes. Permanence here means unchanging over time, regardless of the unit of time, any unit of time. And again, this is a challenge. He's not making a dogmatic statement. He's just saying, examine your experience. What do you think? What do you see? And he says, that which is impermanent, is it unsatisfying or satisfying? Is it painful or pleasant? And the bhikkhus say, unsatisfying, Bhante, painful, Bhante. When I first read this, which is many years ago, the Buddha lost me completely at this point. I didn't know what he was talking about, but at this point I thought, this is ridiculous. This is just silly. What is wrong with change? I mean, if things did not change, they would get very boring very quickly. So what is his problem? Why does he not like change? Well, what he's getting at, you don't find it in the English, permanent, impermanent, but you find it in the Pali, nitya, anicca. Nitya in Pali, ordinary everyday Pali, means permanent, but it also means reliable. We have the same sense. If we say that the monastery here is secure because it has a permanent food supply for the monks. If we say it's a permanent food supply, we're saying it's a reliable food supply. The monks don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. They can be secure that they will be fed. Permanent in Pali also implies reliable. Something which is impermanent is unreliable. I cannot rely on this because sooner or later it will disappoint me. The monks, being good Buddhists, know that sooner or later they're going to get down to the bottom of the hill and there'll be no one there. No breakfast today. This is impermanence. If something is impermanent, I cannot rely upon it. Sooner or later it will disappoint me. If my happiness depends upon it, I am in trouble. Maybe not today, but one day. This is why that which is impermanent and subject to change is unsatisfying, painful. Dukkha, this is the second of the three characteristics. The first universal characteristic, impermanence. The second is dukkha. And the Buddha says, and that which is unsatisfying and subject to change, is it appropriate to regard it in terms of, this is mine, I am this is myself? And the monks reply, certainly not, Bhante. Here the Buddha gets to the whole idea of the self. It's again important to realise when the Buddha is talking about self and not self, what he is actually talking about. People often think that he's talking about a something which either exists or doesn't exist. So we either have an immortal soul or we don't, for example. But he's not talking about that at all. What he's talking about is a relationship to experience. And it's a threefold relationship which he conveys in the words, this is mine, I am this is myself. The three relationships are craving, conceit, and view. Now, first of all, notice that each of these relationships concern this. This is mine. I am this. This is myself. It's very specific. The Buddha's not making a general metaphysical statement about the self with a capital S. He's talking about ordinary, mundane experience. This is mine. I am this. This is myself. He's talking about three relationships, and he's talking about them in very specific, concrete terms. So let's look at these three relationships. The self for the Buddha is not a something, and it's not a someone. It's a project of making something mine, identifying with something, and seeing it as a self. And this project is based on three movements: craving, conceit, and view. So craving, the first one, this is mine. This represents tanha, craving, that we talked about before. So we have this sense of something missing, and we're driven to reach out into the world and grab something to fill that gap. And this is the drive, the urge to possess. I must possess. I must own something. Obviously we see this in consumerism. I must have more money. I must have a better job. I must have a latest model car and computer. But it's much more subtle than that. This drive to possess. Now, at SPS, we're all meditators, and of course we are not materialists, are we? We don't particularly care about material matters. Our friends might get caught up in going on nice holidays and so on, but we don't, because we're good meditators. But let's go deeper here. If we ask ourselves, what is this retreat for? If you ask yourself, what is this retreat for? What is this Dharma talk for? What's it about? Isn't it about me? Isn't it about me and my practice and my enlightenment and my life. Isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that what gives this retreat meaning and significance? Isn't it important because it's about me, because it's mine? This drive to possess goes very deep. Sometimes when people have finished a retreat, they're leaving and they're very happy. They think that I've done a good job. And they might say, I got a lot out of this retreat. This is mine. And I'm walking away with more possessions than I had when I came, which means that it's good. I got all these insights from this retreat, and they're mine. So this drive to possess goes very, 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 very deep. This view is mine. This thought is mine. This is craving, the urge to possess, and from this we construct a self. If there's a possession, there's the owner. Let's say you have a very nice something. Let's say someone visits your house and a polite guest, and they're sitting in the main room and they look around and say, oh, you have such a beautiful house. And you say, thank you. And someone might stop and think, why are you saying thank you when they're saying the house is beautiful? Do you think you are your house? It's a compliment directed at the house, not at you. So why should you say thank you? Maybe you should say thank you to the architect. But we identify with our possessions. To compliment someone's possession is to compliment them. This is mine. I am this. So possession segues into identification. I become my possession. I am what I own. This is conceit. Conceit is the English translation of the Pali word mana. It's a very bad translation because there's no exact English equivalent to mana. Mana essentially means measurement or measuring. Mana comes from the root ma, to measure. Let's say I decide to measure this table. Get out the measuring tape and I measure the breadth of this table. And I establish it so many centimetres. What have I done in the act of measuring it? I've separated the table from everything else. Now my experience universe consists of that which is table and that which is not table. Once I've measured it, I've established boundaries. It ends here. It begins there. Everything beyond that is not table. I have the table and I have not table. Identity, difference. Self, other. Me, not me. Mana, conceit, is the act of measuring off part of experience and saying, this is me. And it has a boundary. It ends. There are obvious boundaries, like a physical boundary. I end here, and then the pad begins. So this is me, and that's not me. But the boundaries are bigger than that. You notice how you get uncomfortable if someone gets too close, especially if they're a stranger. We have a sense of personal space. You're crowding into my space. You're threatening me. You're stepping somehow into me if you get too close and you're not the right person. Or we talked about the possession. My sense of my boundaries extends to what I own. People whose houses are robbed, often they say what's even worse than the loss of the actual possessions is the sense of personal violation, that someone who should not be there has been in here. And this sense of the person, the self, has been violated by this action. Mana is this sense of a boundary between self and other. I'm here and there's the rest of the world. I am this, not that. And finally, view. This is myself. This is ditthi, or view. Out of these three movements, view is the most obvious. It's the most surface. View represents who we think we are and who we think others are. So I have a view of myself. So I am the teacher. That's why at the mealtime I come to the steps and I just walk down. Everybody get out of the way. The teacher is coming. It's a classic identity problem, because the first day I was just standing in line. And I thought, I'll just stand in line. But then someone saw me and said, oh, the teacher, Mr. Patrick, move. Oh, okay. So I move 1 or 2 steps. I'm standing there. But then the person goes, the person in front, oh. They step aside. So I move a bit further. And then this wave of agitation. And I thought, I may as well just walk down. Either way, it's going to be socially difficult. I'll have to choose one. Sometimes I think I should go around the other side and come round. I thought, no, I'll just go down the stairs. This is view. I am the teacher, which makes me, in this community, somehow different, special. But it's not just me who thinks that. It's everybody else who's conspiring in the same view. Everyone looks at me as if I'm the teacher. When I go home to my wife, I'm not the teacher. I'm a very naughty boy, because I haven't done this and I haven't done that. Suddenly I'm someone else. I have a different identity. This is myself. And it's partly social, what other people think I am. If people relate to me as someone, I'll become that someone. And partly it's who I think I am. You know, I think I'm the teacher. I think I'm a good teacher. I'm okay. Meditators are doing well. So I feel good about that. Or I might feel, no, I'm a terrible teacher. Meditators are doing really badly. So this is view, and we find a lot of it in the thoughts that are going through the mind. When we think, who are we thinking about? We think about ourselves and others in relation to us, others as mine, my children, my friends, my family. And the thoughts create ourselves. A classic example in meditation retreat is I have a good sitting, the mind is very clear, peaceful, and at the end of it I think, I can do this. This is no problem. I'm a good meditator. In fact, I'm a very good meditator. In fact, I'm probably better than all of these other hopeless people. I see them talking all the time and wandering about and not being mindful. Whereas I think I'm pretty good. I'm a very good meditator. So I congratulate myself and go off and have a nice cup of tea and come back confident for the next sitting. I sit down, terrible, hopeless, can't focus, and I think, I'm a terrible meditator. I'm probably the worst meditator in this room. So I create a self, and then I create another one, and then another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And this is view, and my view of myself. The self for the Buddha is not a something, and it's not even a someone. It's a project. It's something that we are doing. We are selfing all of the time. And it takes a lot of energy. We put a lot of work into this, which is one of the reasons why when we actually drop the self, it's generally such a huge relief. Oh, I don't have to do all that work. The self is something that we do. We create a sense of a self and hang on to it. It's very important to us. What the Buddha is suggesting here is that actually it doesn't exist. What exists are the thoughts, the feelings, the body sensations, the seeing, the hearing, the words, the choices, the actions. All of these are real. But the self is not. The self is an idea that we have about ourselves. It's a concept. It's actually a useful concept, which is why that we created in the first place. One academic of Buddhism put it very nicely. He said, it's like the average taxpayer. If you're working in the tax department, in the government, and you have to need to decide how much income is the government going to get next year in order to plan how much can be spent and so on. You have to use concepts like the average taxpayer. The average taxpayer will return so many ringgit over the next financial year, and from that we can plan how much money we've got to spend. Now, of course, the average taxpayer does not exist. There's no such person who is the average taxpayer. But the concept, the average taxpayer, is very useful, and you can make real plans and do good things on the basis of this concept. So the self is like that. It's real only as a concept, but it is a useful concept. I can live my life with this concept of myself, and I can do good things with my life with this concept of myself. But it's only a concept. The problem is when I lose that sense and I take it to be absolutely real. That's when we start to get problems. I get stuck on a particular view of myself, and if someone threatens that view, I get very distressed. I might get angry, I might get sad. I can't function properly because this view of who I am is being challenged. Or I have a view of myself which I don't like. I have to admit I really don't like me at all. Or other people don't like me, or whatever. So we get attached to this project, this concept that we have, and it's in the attachment that the problem lies. And the Buddha is cutting away this by he's saying, look at it, look at your actual experience. Where can you find the felt reality of this self, of who you think you are? And of course, the more we look for it, the more we cannot find it. So, if the self isn't there, then what is there? We won't answer that question. We'll just leave it for you to find out by tomorrow night.